23 women knelt on the frozen Texas dirt, their hands clasped together so tightly that their knuckles had turned white. Their lips moved in silent prayer, whispering words they had learned as children in churches across Germany. Words about mercy, words about salvation, words about the life that comes after death. They believed with absolute certainty that the rising sun would be the last thing they ever saw. June 7, 1945. The Chihuahuan Desert of West Texas stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of sagebrush and mesquite, under a sky that was slowly bleeding from purple to orange. The air carried the sharp bite of a desert night, refusing to surrender to morning, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote let out one final howl before retreating to its den. The prisoner of war camp at Fort Davis sat like a small island of wooden buildings and barbed wire in this ocean of emptiness. 80 miles north of the Mexican border, 200 miles from the nearest city of any size, it was the kind of place where a person could disappear and the world would never know. For the 23 German women huddled behind the barracks, this remoteness felt like a death sentence. Margareta Hoffman knelt in the front row. The others called her Greta, a name that felt softer than the formal version her parents had given her 28 years ago in Stuttgart. She was a nurse by training, a woman who had spent 6 years on the battlefields of Europe watching young men die in ways that no medical textbook could have prepared her for. She had held soldiers as they took their last breaths. She had written letters to mothers she would never meet, telling them that their sons had died bravely, even when the truth was far more complicated. Death was not a stranger to Greta Hoffman, but tonight, for the first time in her life, she felt its cold fingers reaching for her own throat. The fear had started the night before, spreading through the group of women like a virus that fed on darkness and uncertainty. Someone had heard something. Someone had seen something. The details were vague, contradictory, impossible to verify, but in the absence of truth, imagination had filled the void with horrors. Hilda Braun, the oldest among them at 45, had been the one to speak the word first: execution. She claimed she had heard the American guards saying it, had recognized the English word from her years working as a secretary in Berlin. The Americans were going to execute them at dawn, she said. They were going to line them up against the barracks wall and shoot them like dogs. It did not matter that Hilda had actually heard the phrase execution of orders, which meant something entirely different. It did not matter that the American military followed the Geneva Convention and had never executed female prisoners of war. Fear does not wait for facts. Fear grows in the dark, nourished by years of propaganda and the trauma of a war that had stripped away every certainty these women had ever known. For 6 years, they had been told that Americans were monsters. The posters on the streets of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg had depicted American soldiers as savage beasts with no culture, no mercy, no humanity. The radio broadcasts had spoken of atrocities committed against German prisoners, of torture and humiliation and death. These images had been planted in their minds like seeds, and now in the darkness of a Texas night, those seeds had grown into a forest of terror that blocked out all reason. Greta looked at the women around her. Some were barely older than girls, teenagers who had been working in munitions factories when the war ended. Others were middle-aged women who had served as nurses, telephone operators, or military cooks. All of them had been swept up in the chaos of Germany's collapse, captured by American forces during the final weeks of the war, and transported across an ocean to this place they had never heard of. They had nothing in common except their nationality and their fear. To Greta's left knelt Elsa Vogel, the youngest of the group at 19 years old. Her eyes were the color of a Bavarian summer sky, and her blonde hair, once carefully styled, now hung limp and dirty around her face. Elsa had been working at the Krupp ammunition plant when the Americans came. She had never fired a weapon, never worn a proper uniform, never done anything except sort shell casings on an assembly line. But the Americans had taken her anyway because she was German, because she was there, because war does not distinguish between soldiers and civilians when it decides who to swallow. Elsa was crying, silent tears streaming down her cheeks and dripping onto the frozen ground. Earlier that night, she had whispered something to Greta that had broken the older woman's heart. "I have never been kissed," Elsa had said. "I am going to die without ever knowing what it feels like to be kissed." Greta had not known how to respond. What comfort could she offer to a girl who believed she had only hours left to live? So she had simply taken Elsa's hand and held it, feeling the trembling that ran through the young woman's body like an electrical current. Now, as the sky grew lighter and the moment of truth approached, Greta made a decision. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she would face it standing. She would not give the Americans the satisfaction of seeing her crawl. Whatever happens, she whispered to the women around her, we stand straight. We do not beg. We do not kneel before the enemy. The words were meant to sound brave, but her voice cracked on the final syllable. She was terrified, and she knew that everyone around her could hear it. But what these women were about to discover would not be death. What waited for them beyond the barracks gate was something they could never have imagined, something that would challenge everything they had been taught about enemies, about Americans, about the very nature of human kindness. Because the enemy was not sharpening bayonets in the early morning light. The enemy was frying bacon. To understand why 23 educated, intelligent women could believe so completely that they were about to be executed, we must go back further. We must understand what they had been told, what they had seen, and what the war had done to their ability to trust. Germany in 1945 was a nation built on lies. For 12 years, the Nazi propaganda machine had constructed an alternate reality where Germany was always winning, where enemies were always subhuman, and where the German people were victims of a global conspiracy. The truth was not simply hidden, it was replaced with a carefully crafted fiction that permeated every aspect of daily life. Americans in this fiction were portrayed as the worst of all enemies. They were depicted as a mongrel race, a chaotic mix of criminals and degenerates from a country without history or culture. The posters showed them with exaggerated features, wielding bloody weapons, committing unspeakable acts against German civilians. The newspapers printed stories of American soldiers massacring prisoners, burning villages, and treating captured Germans with a cruelty that exceeded even the worst excesses of medieval warfare. These images were burned into the minds of every German citizen. Even those who secretly doubted the propaganda, even those who had heard whispers of a different truth, could not entirely escape its influence. When you are told something every day for 12 years, it becomes part of how you see the world, whether you want it to or not. Greta Hoffman was not a fanatic. She had joined the military nursing corps not out of ideological conviction, but because she believed in healing, in helping and easing suffering wherever she found it. Her father had been a doctor, her mother a piano teacher, and she had been raised with values that transcended politics, kindness, compassion, duty to others. But even Greta had absorbed the propaganda. Even she, with her education and her experience, could not look at an American soldier without feeling a spike of fear that came from somewhere deeper than reason. The fear was not logical, it was instinctual, planted so deep that it had become part of her nervous system. This is what the women of Fort Davis carried with them as they knelt in the darkness. Not just fear of the unknown, but fear of a specific enemy they had been taught to hate and dread for their entire adult lives. And now that enemy was walking toward them. The sound of boots on gravel cut through the pre-dawn silence like a knife. 23 heads snapped up. 23 pairs of eyes strained to see through the dim light. 2 American soldiers approached the gate of the women's compound. They were tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the olive-drab uniforms that had become synonymous with occupation and defeat. One of them carried a clipboard. The other reached for the lock on the gate. "This is it," someone whispered in German. "Oh God, this is it." Greta felt Elsa's grip on her hand tighten to the point of pain. She wanted to say something reassuring, but her mouth had gone completely dry. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, drowning out everything else. The gate swung open with a creak of metal hinges. "All women follow us," one of the soldiers said in English. No one understood the words, but the gesture was clear enough. "Stand up, come with us." Greta was the first to rise. Her legs felt like they were made of water, but she forced them to hold her weight. She pulled Elsa up beside her, then reached for Hilda on her other side. One by one, the women stood, forming a ragged line of exhaustion and terror. The soldiers did not point guns at them. They did not shout or threaten. They simply turned and began walking clearly, expecting the women to follow. Greta took a step, then another. Her body moved forward, even as her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything except walk calmly toward what she believed was her own execution. The group crossed the compound in silence. They passed rows of wooden barracks supply sheds, a motor pool where military vehicles sat waiting for the day's work. The camp was beginning to wake up around them, with other soldiers emerging from buildings, stretching, lighting cigarettes, going about the mundane business of mourning. None of them seemed to notice the procession of condemned women. None of them showed any sign that something terrible was about to happen. This struck Greta as strange. If they were about to witness an execution, wouldn't there be some indication? Wouldn't the mood be different, heavier, more charged with violence? Then she smelled it. The aroma hit her like a physical force, stopping her mid-stride. It was a smell she had not encountered in years, a smell that belonged to a different world, a world before rationing and hunger, and the constant gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Bacon. Someone was frying bacon. And beneath that, other smells. Eggs, coffee, fresh bread. Greta's confusion deepened. Why would the Americans be cooking breakfast if they were about to kill prisoners? It made no sense unless this was some kind of final meal, a last gesture of mercy before the inevitable. Behind her, she heard Elsa gasp. The young woman had smelled it too. "What is that?" Elsa whispered. "Is that food?" Greta did not answer. She could not answer. Her mind was trying to process too many contradictory signals at once, and it was failing. The soldiers led them around a corner, and suddenly they were standing in front of a large wooden building. A sign above the door read "Mess Hall" in large English letters. Through the windows, Greta could see long tables covered with white cloths, metal trays stacked high with food, and a massive man in a cook's apron standing behind a serving counter. The soldier with the clipboard opened the door and stepped aside. "Go in," he said, gesturing with his hand. "Breakfast. Breakfast." The word hung in the air, incomprehensible. Greta knew enough English to recognize it, but her brain refused to accept what it meant. There had to be a mistake. There had to be something she was missing. She looked at the soldier, searching his face for any sign of cruelty or deception. What she saw instead was something she had not expected. Boredom. The man looked bored, like this was just another routine task in a long series of routine tasks. Like feeding German prisoners was about as significant as filing paperwork or changing a tire. "Go on," he said again, a hint of impatience in his voice. "Food's getting cold." Greta took a step toward the door, then another. She crossed the threshold and entered the mess hall, and the warmth of the room wrapped around her like a blanket. The smell was overwhelming now. Bacon and eggs and fresh biscuits and hot coffee, all of it mixing together in an olfactory symphony that made her stomach clench with hunger. Long tables stretched across the room, set with plates and cups and silverware. At the far end, a serving line was staffed by American cooks who were piling food onto trays with practiced efficiency. And behind the main counter stood the largest man Greta had ever seen. He was at least 6'3", maybe taller, with shoulders as wide as a doorway and hands that looked like they could crush a watermelon. His white apron was stained with grease, and a broad smile was spread across his weather-beaten face. "Welcome, ladies," he called out in a booming voice that filled the room. "Name's Jim Crawford. Breakfast is ready." Greta stood frozen just inside the door, unable to move. Behind her, the other women were filtering in their faces, showing the same mixture of shock and disbelief that she felt. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate deception designed to give them hope before crushing it completely. But the food was real. She could see it steaming on the serving line. Scrambled eggs golden and fluffy, strips of bacon crisp and glistening, biscuits piled in baskets, their tops browned to perfection, pitchers of orange juice, pots of coffee sending curls of steam toward the ceiling. Elsa was the first to move. The 19-year-old walked forward as if in a trance, her eyes fixed on the food like a pilgrim approaching a holy shrine. She stopped in front of Jim Crawford, her head barely reaching his chest, and looked up at him with an expression of pure bewilderment. Crawford's smile softened. Without a word, he picked up a plate and began filling it. Eggs, bacon, a biscuit split open and spread with butter. He handed it to Elsa with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. "Eat," he said, his voice dropping to something almost paternal. "You're safe now." Elsa did not understand the English words, but she understood the tone. And something inside her, some wall that had been holding back a flood of emotion, suddenly collapsed. She began to cry. Not the silent tears of before, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She clutched the plate to her chest as if it might disappear, as if this moment of kindness might be snatched away at any second. The other women rushed forward to comfort her, surrounding her in a protective circle of shared disbelief. Greta remained by the door watching. Her mind was racing, trying to recalibrate everything she thought she knew. These were the monsters. These were the savage beasts who tortured prisoners and showed no mercy. This massive man with his gentle voice and his platters of bacon and eggs. Nothing made sense anymore. The world she had believed in, the world of clear enemies and certain dangers, was crumbling around her. She thought about all the years of propaganda, all the posters and broadcasts and newspaper articles. She thought about the fear that had kept her awake the night before, the absolute certainty that she was going to die. And she thought about what was actually happening right now in this mess hall in the middle of the Texas desert. The Americans were feeding them, not as a prelude to execution, not as some kind of cruel joke. They were simply feeding them because it was morning and prisoners needed to eat. Greta walked slowly toward the serving line. Her legs still felt weak, but for a different reason now. The adrenaline of fear was draining away, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound that she could barely stay upright. Jim Crawford saw her approaching and gave her the same warm smile he had given Elsa. "You look like you could use some coffee," he said. "Strong and black Texas style. Best cure for whatever ails you." He poured a cup and held it out to her. Greta took it with trembling hands. The ceramic was warm against her palms, almost too hot to hold, but she did not let go. The heat felt like proof that this was real, that she was not dreaming, that she was actually standing in an American mess hall being served coffee by a man who looked like he belonged on a cattle ranch. She took a sip. The coffee was bitter and strong, nothing like the weak ersatz brew she had choked down in Germany for the past 3 years. It burned going down, but in a good way, spreading warmth through her chest and into her stomach. "Thank you," she said in careful English. It was one of the few phrases she knew. Crawford's smile widened. "You're welcome, ma'am. Now get yourself some food. You're way too skinny." Greta looked at the serving line, at the mountains of eggs and bacon, at the baskets of biscuits, at the abundance that seemed almost obscene after years of rationing and scarcity. In Germany by 1945, meat had become a distant memory for most civilians. Eggs were a luxury reserved for the sick or the elderly. Coffee was made from roasted acorns and chicory, and here in this prisoner of war camp in the middle of nowhere, there was more food than Greta had seen in 5 years. She picked up a tray and began to fill it. Eggs, bacon, a biscuit. She moved down the line like a sleepwalker, piling food onto her plate with no real awareness of what she was doing. Her body was operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to catch up with reality. She found a seat at one of the long tables and sat down. Around her, the other women were doing the same, their faces showing varying degrees of shock, relief, and confusion. Some were eating with desperate hunger, shoveling food into their mouths as if afraid it might vanish. Others were crying, tears mixing with the eggs on their plates. A few simply sat and stared, unable to process what was happening. Greta picked up her fork and cut a piece of bacon. She raised it to her lips. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and fat and smoke, a flavor so intense that it almost hurt. She chewed slowly, savoring every second, feeling the bacon dissolve into pure pleasure. When was the last time she had tasted bacon? 3 years ago? 4? She could not remember. But she knew she would never forget this moment, this first bite of forbidden food in an enemy mess hall, this instant when everything she believed about Americans began to crack. She took another bite, and another. The bacon was followed by eggs, soft and rich, seasoned with salt and pepper. Then a biscuit so light and fluffy that it seemed to float on her tongue, the butter melting into the bread and releasing the sweetness that made her close her eyes in pure bliss. Across the table, Hilda Braun was eating in silence, her expression unreadable. The older woman had been so certain of their fate, so convinced that the Americans were going to kill them. Now she sat with a plate of food in front of her, forced to confront the possibility that everything she believed was wrong. Greta understood the struggle. She was going through it herself. When your entire worldview is built on a foundation of lies, what happens when that foundation crumbles? What do you believe when everything you were taught turns out to be false? She did not have answers. She only had questions. And the biggest question of all was this: if the propaganda about Americans was wrong, what else had been a lie? It was a question that would haunt her for the rest of her time at Fort Davis. And it was a question that would eventually change her life. Halfway through the meal, the door of the mess hall opened again. A man in his early 40s entered, wearing the insignia of a captain. He had salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the bearing of someone who was more comfortable in a classroom than on a battlefield. This was Captain William Harrison, commanding officer of Fort Davis. Before the war, he had been a history teacher at a high school in Austin. He had joined the Army at 37, too old for combat duty, and had been assigned to manage prisoner of war facilities. It was not glamorous work, but Harrison approached it with the same dedication he had brought to teaching a belief that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of which side of a war they happened to be on. He walked to the center of the room and waited. Beside him stood a young corporal named Thomas Weber, who served as the camp's translator. Weber was American-born, but his parents had emigrated from Germany in the 1920s, and he spoke the language fluently. The women stopped eating. The brief bubble of comfort that the food had created was suddenly pierced by a new wave of anxiety. Here was authority. Here was the power to decide their fate. Harrison saw the fear in their faces and felt a pang of sadness. He had seen this look many times before in the eyes of prisoners who expected cruelty and could not believe when they received kindness instead. It was, he thought, one of the greatest tragedies of war, not just the death and destruction, but the way it poisoned people's ability to trust. "Good morning," he said in English, and Weber translated, "I am Captain Harrison, commander of this camp. I want to explain a few things about what to expect during your time here." He paused, letting the translation catch up. "First, you are prisoners of war, not criminals. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That means adequate food, shelter, and medical care." Another pause for translation. Greta listened intently, her heart pounding. Was this real? Could she believe what she was hearing? "Second, you will be asked to perform light work around the camp. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, that sort of thing. No forced labor. If you are sick, you will be excused from work." The women exchanged glances. This was not what they had expected. This was not what they had been told about American captivity. Third, Harrison paused, and something in his voice changed. It became softer, more personal. "I know what you have been taught about Americans. I know you have been told that we are monsters, that we torture prisoners, that we show no mercy. I want you to know that those things are not true." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of as many women as he could. "The war is over. Germany has surrendered. There is no more fighting, no more killing, no more reason for us to be enemies. As far as I am concerned, you are not enemies anymore. You are just people far from home, waiting to go back to your families." Weber finished translating. Silence filled the mess hall. Greta felt something shifting inside her. It was a small movement, like a crack appearing in a dam. Not enough to break through, not yet, but enough to let a tiny trickle of doubt seep through. A doubt about everything she had believed. She looked at Captain Harrison, at his kind eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses, at the sincerity in his face. He did not look like a monster. He looked like someone's father, someone's teacher, someone who had seen too much of war and wanted nothing more than for it to be over. "I cannot make you trust us," Harrison continued. "Trust has to be earned. All I can do is show you day by day that we mean what we say, that the America you were taught to fear is not the real America." He nodded once, a small gesture of respect. "Enjoy your breakfast. If you need anything, ask the guards. We are here to help." And with that, he turned and walked out of the mess hall, leaving behind a room full of women who were no longer sure what to believe. Greta watched him go. Then she looked down at her plate, at the half-eaten eggs and bacon, at the crumbs of biscuit scattered across the surface. An hour ago, she had been certain she was going to die. Now she was sitting in a warm room, her stomach full for the first time in months, having just been told by an American officer that she was not an enemy anymore. The world had turned upside down. Everything she thought she knew was wrong. And as the morning sun rose higher over the Texas desert, filling the mess hall with golden light, Greta Hoffman began the slow, painful process of rebuilding her understanding of the world. It would not happen overnight. It would not be easy, but it had begun. Because sometimes the first step toward healing is as simple as a plate of bacon and eggs served with kindness by a stranger you were taught to hate. The breakfast continued in a strange, dreamlike atmosphere. Women who had been preparing to die an hour ago now found themselves reaching for second helpings, unable to resist the abundance that surrounded them. Jim Crawford worked behind the counter with quiet efficiency, refilling platters of eggs, frying more bacon, making sure every woman had enough to eat. He did not speak much, but his presence filled the room. There was something reassuring about his size, about his calm competence, about the way he moved through the kitchen, like a man who had found his purpose in life. He was not a soldier in any traditional sense. He was a cook, a feeder of people, and he did his job with a pride that transcended military rank. Greta watched him from her seat, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been taught. This man was her enemy. His country had bombed German cities, killed German soldiers, brought the Reich to its knees. By every measure of the war she had lived through, she should hate him. But she could not hate a man who had just given her the best meal she had eaten in years. She could not hate someone whose first words to her had been about coffee and kindness. It was confusing. It was disorienting. And she was beginning to realize the beginning of something new. The women finished their breakfast, slowly reluctant to leave the warmth and safety of the mess hall. Outside, the Texas sun was climbing higher, and the day's work awaited them. But for now, in this moment, they were content to simply exist in a place where no one was trying to kill them. Elsa had stopped crying and was now working on her third biscuit, her cheeks flushed with color that had not been there before. Hilda sat in silence, her plate empty, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance that only she could see. The other women talked quietly among themselves, their voices a mixture of German and broken English, trying to make sense of what had happened. Greta did not speak. She sat with her empty coffee cup, turning it slowly in her hands, feeling the residual warmth that still clung to the ceramic. Her mind was full of questions, doubts, fears, and something else. Something that felt almost like hope. She did not know what the future held. She did not know how long she would be at Fort Davis, or what would happen when she finally returned to Germany. She did not know if her parents were alive, if her home was still standing, if there was anything left of the world she had known before the war. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had expected death, and she had received breakfast instead. And that, for now, was enough. The first week at Fort Davis passed in a blur of small discoveries and quiet transformations. Each morning began the same way. The women would wake to the sound of reveille echoing across the desert dress in the simple clothes the Americans had provided and walk to the mess hall for breakfast. Each morning, Jim Crawford stood behind his counter with fresh coffee and a smile that never seemed to waver. Each morning, the food was hot and plentiful, a daily reminder that the world they had known was gone and something new had taken its place. Greta Hoffman found herself falling into a routine. After breakfast, she would report to the camp's small medical station where an American Army doctor named Lieutenant Michael Chen had agreed to let her assist with basic nursing duties. It was work she knew, work that made sense, work that allowed her to feel useful in a world where she had lost almost everything else. The medical station was nothing like the field hospitals where she had served during the war. There were no screaming wounded, no desperate amputations performed by candlelight, no endless parade of young men torn apart by bullets and bombs. Instead, there were minor injuries and common illnesses, the ordinary ailments of people living in close quarters in a harsh climate. Blisters, sunburn, the occasional stomach complaint from someone who had eaten too much too quickly after months of deprivation. It was peaceful work, almost boring, and for Greta, that peace felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. But even as her body settled into the rhythms of camp life, her mind remained restless. The questions that had begun on that first morning refused to go away. They multiplied in the quiet moments, growing like weeds in the fertile soil of her uncertainty. If the Americans were not monsters, then why had she been taught to fear them? If the propaganda was lies, then what else had been false? And if everything she believed about her enemies was wrong, what did that say about her own country, her own people, her own participation in a war that had consumed the world? These questions haunted her during the long Texas afternoons when the heat made work impossible, and the women retreated to the shade of their barracks to wait for evening. They followed her into sleep, appearing in dreams that mixed memory and imagination into strange and troubling tableaus. They were always there, lurking beneath the surface of every conversation, every meal, every moment of apparent calm. She did not speak of them to the other women. She suspected they were wrestling with similar doubts, but there seemed to be an unspoken agreement that certain things were better left unexamined. The present was strange enough without digging too deeply into the implications of the past. But Greta could not stop digging. It was not in her nature to accept comfortable illusions. She needed to understand, even if understanding brought pain. What she did not know was that the answers to some of her questions were closer than she realized. They were waiting in the camp kitchen, in the heart of a man she had dismissed as a simple cook, in a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about enemies and allies, about hatred and forgiveness, about the complicated ways that war entangles the lives of people on opposite sides. The secret belonged to Jim Crawford, and it was about to come to light. While the German women were adapting to their new reality, Jim Crawford was fighting his own quiet battle. Every morning he woke at 4:30 to begin preparing breakfast. Every evening he stayed late to clean the kitchen and prepare for the next day. In between, he cooked 3 meals for several hundred people, managed a staff of assistant cooks, and dealt with the endless logistical challenges of feeding a prisoner of war camp in the middle of the Texas desert. It was hard work, but Jim did not mind hard work. He had been working hard his entire life, from his childhood in Hamburg to his adolescence in Marfa, to his adult years as a ranch hand, a short-order cook, and finally an Army mess sergeant. Hard work was familiar. Hard work was comfortable. Hard work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to places he did not want it to go. But lately the work was not enough. The arrival of the German women had stirred something in Jim that he had spent 25 years trying to bury. Hearing their language, seeing their faces, watching them struggle with the same fears and confusions that he remembered from his own displacement, it had brought everything back. The memories he had tried to forget, the identity he had tried to erase, the grandmother he had loved and lost and never stopped mourning. Jim Crawford had not always been Jim Crawford. He had been born Johann Schmidt in Hamburg, Germany in the year 1905. His father Karl had been a baker, a quiet man with flour-dusted hands and a gentle smile. His mother Emma had been an American, a young woman from Texas who had traveled to Europe on a whim and fallen in love with a German baker and decided to stay. For 15 years, Johann had lived a happy life in Hamburg. He had learned to bake bread in his father's shop. He had played in the streets with neighborhood children. He had listened to his grandmother, Margaret, tell stories about the old days, about her own childhood in a Germany that seemed impossibly distant and romantic. Then in 1918, his father had died. The influenza pandemic that swept the world after the Great War had taken Karl Schmidt in 3 days, leaving Emma a widow and Johann an orphan in everything but name. Emma had made a decision. She would take her son back to Texas, back to the country of her birth, back to a place where the memories of Karl would not haunt every corner of every room. She would give Johann a new name, a new identity, a new chance at life in a land that did not carry the weight of so much loss. So Johann Schmidt had become James Crawford, taking the surname of his maternal grandfather. He had learned English, adopted the manners and customs of his new country, and slowly, painfully transformed himself into an American. By the time he was 20, most people who met him would never have guessed that he had been born on the other side of the Atlantic. His accent was pure Texas. His loyalties were unquestionable. He was as American as apple pie. But late at night when no one was watching, Jim Crawford still dreamed in German. He still remembered the smell of his father's bakery, the sound of his grandmother's voice, the feeling of belonging to a place and a people that he had been forced to leave behind. And he still had the letter. It sat in the bottom of his footlocker, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements, the last communication he had ever received from his grandmother. She had written it in 1940, just before the war made correspondence between America and Germany impossible. He had read it so many times that he knew every word by heart, but he still took it out sometimes late at night just to see her handwriting and remember that she had been real. "My dear Johann," the letter began, "I do not know if this will reach you. The world is going mad, and I fear that we may never see each other again. But I want you to know that I think of you every day. I am proud of the man you have become, even if I have only heard about him through your mother's letters. And I want you to remember something, no matter what happens, kindness has no nationality. Be kind, my grandson. Be kind to everyone you meet, regardless of where they come from or what language they speak. That is the only way to survive in a world that seems determined to tear itself apart." Jim had tried to live by those words. He had tried to be kind, to treat every person who came through his mess hall with dignity and respect, regardless of their uniform or their accent or the side they had fought on. It was his way of honoring his grandmother, of keeping her memory alive, of proving that the values she had taught him could survive even the madness of war. But the arrival of the German women had tested his resolve in ways he had not expected. Hearing them speak the language of his childhood, seeing them huddled together in fear and confusion, watching them slowly begin to trust the Americans who had captured them, it had awakened feelings he thought he had buried long ago. He wanted to tell them that he understood. He wanted to speak to them in their own language, to offer comfort in words they could comprehend without translation. He wanted to share his story to show them that the divide between German and American was not as absolute as they might think. But he could not. To reveal his origins would be to invite questions he was not prepared to answer. It would complicate his position in the camp, raise doubts about his loyalties, potentially even put him under suspicion. The war might be over, but the suspicions it had created would take years to fade. So Jim kept his secret, serving breakfast with a smile, hiding his German words behind a Texas drawl, and reading his grandmother's letter alone in the darkness of the Texas night. He did not know that his secret was about to be discovered. And he did not know that the discovery would lead to a connection that would change both his life and the life of a German nurse named Margaret. The night was unseasonably cold for early July, the kind of desert night when the heat of the day vanishes as soon as the sun sets and the temperature drops 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Greta could not sleep. She lay on her bunk in the women's barracks, listening to the breathing of 22 other women, staring at the wooden ceiling above her head. Her mind would not stop racing, cycling through the same questions and doubts that had plagued her for weeks. Finally, around midnight, she gave up. She rose, quietly wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and slipped out of the barracks into the cold night air. The camp was quiet at this hour. A few guards patrolled the perimeter, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights, but the interior of the camp was still and peaceful. The only sounds were the distant howl of a coyote and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. Greta walked toward the mess hall. She was not sure why. Perhaps she was hoping to find some water, or perhaps she simply needed to move to feel her body doing something other than lying in bed and thinking. As she approached the building, she saw a light in the kitchen window. Someone was still awake. She considered turning back, not wanting to intrude, but curiosity got the better of her. Who would be working in the kitchen at midnight? She crept closer to the window and peered inside. Jim Crawford sat at a small table in the corner of the kitchen, his massive frame hunched over a piece of paper. A single lamp cast a pool of yellow light around him, leaving the rest of the kitchen in shadow. He was reading something, his lips moving silently as his eyes traced the lines on the page. And then he spoke. The words were soft, barely audible through the window glass, but Greta recognized them instantly. They were German. Mein lieber Johann, Jim murmured, reading from the paper. Ich weiß nicht, ob dies dich erreichen wird. My dear Johann, I do not know if this will reach you. Greta felt her heart stop. The American cook was reading a letter in German. Not just reading it, but reading it with the accent of a native speaker, with the rhythms and intonations of someone who had grown up with the language. How was this possible? She must have made some sound, some small gasp or movement, because Jim suddenly looked up. His eyes found the window, found her face pressed against the glass, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then Jim stood up, walked to the door, and opened at her. You heard, he said. It was not a question. Greta nodded, unable to speak. Jim studied her face for a moment, searching for something. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, because he stepped aside and gestured toward the interior of the kitchen. Come in, he said. I think we need to talk. Greta hesitated. Every instinct told her to retreat, to pretend she had seen nothing, to maintain the safe distance between prisoner and captor that had defined their relationship until now. But something stronger than instinct pulled her forward. Curiosity, need, the desperate desire to understand something, anything about this confusing new world she found herself in. She stepped into the kitchen. Jim closed the door behind her and gestured toward a chair at the small table. Sit, he said. I will make coffee. He moved to the stove and began preparing a pot, his movements automatic and practiced. Greta sat down, her eyes falling on the paper he had been reading. It was a letter written in a flowing Germanic script on paper that had yellowed with age. She could see the date at the top, March 1940. Jim returned with 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. He did not speak immediately, just wrapped his large hands around his cup and stared into the dark liquid as if searching for words. My grandmother wrote that letter, he finally said, from Hamburg, 5 years ago. Greta looked at him, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Your grandmother was German. Jim nodded. I was born in Hamburg. My name was Johann Schmidt. I came to America when I was 15 after my father died. He told her the story about his father, the baker, and his American mother, about the influenza epidemic and the decision to emigrate, about the transformation from Johann to Jim, from German to American, from one identity to another. Greta listened in silence, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet once again. This man, this enemy, this American who had been feeding her breakfast for weeks, he was not so different from her after all. He carried German blood in his veins and German words in his heart. He knew what it meant to be displaced, to lose a homeland, to rebuild a life from the wreckage of circumstances beyond his control. The grandmother, Greta said when he finished. What happened to her? Jim's face darkened. I do not know. Hamburg was bombed in 1943. Thousands died. I have tried to find information, but everything is case. Records destroyed, families scattered. She could be dead. She could be alive. I simply do not know. He picked up the letter again, handling it with a tenderness that seemed almost incongruous for a man of his size. Her name was Margaret, he said, like yours. Greta felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the desert night. The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore, as if the universe was trying to tell her something she was not quite ready to understand. They talked until nearly dawn. Jim spoke in a mixture of English and German, switching between the languages with an ease that came from a lifetime of living between two worlds. Greta responded in kind, her own English improving with each passing hour, as she found words she had not known she possessed. They talked about their families, their fears, their losses. They talked about the war, about the things they had seen and done, about the guilt that neither of them could quite escape. They talked about the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this moment, sitting in a kitchen in the middle of the Texas desert, sharing coffee and secrets in the dead of night. War makes monsters of us all, Jim said at one point, his voice heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. That is what my grandmother always said. But we do not have to stay monsters. We can choose to be something else. Greta thought about those words for a long time after she returned to her barracks, lying in bed, as the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. We do not have to stay monsters. It was a simple idea, almost naive in its optimism, but it was also the most hopeful thing anyone had said to her in years. Maybe that was the answer to all her questions. Maybe the point was not to understand why she had believed lies for so long, but to decide what she was going to believe now. Maybe the past could not be changed, but the future was still unwritten. She fell asleep with those thoughts circling in her mind, and for the first time since coming to Fort Davis, she did not dream of death. The days that followed were different. Greta found herself looking forward to meals in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She would sit at her usual table, eating her usual food, but her eyes would drift toward the kitchen, toward the large figure moving behind the counter, and she would feel a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between prisoner and captor. Jim seemed to feel it too. He began finding excuses to visit the medical station, claiming minor ailments that clearly did not bother him, just to spend a few minutes talking to her. Their conversations were brief and carefully neutral, always conducted in English, always within earshot of others, but beneath the surface lay a deeper understanding that neither of them spoke of openly. Meanwhile, Elsa Vogel had become Jim's unofficial apprentice in the kitchen. The young woman had shown an unexpected aptitude for baking, and Jim had taken her under his wing, teaching her the skills he had learned from his father in Hamburg all those years ago. Every afternoon, while the other women rested in the shade, Elsa would don an apron and take her place beside the massive cook, learning to knead dough and measure ingredients and coax temperamental ovens into producing perfect results. One afternoon, Jim decided to teach her something special. Apple pie, he announced, pulling out a handwritten recipe card. My grandmother's recipe. The best apple pie you will ever taste. Elsa looked at the card covered in the same flowing Germanic script as the letter Greta had seen. She could not read the words, but she recognized the language. Your grandmother was German? She asked, surprised. Jim nodded. From Hamburg. She taught me to bake when I was a boy. This recipe has been in my family for 3 generations. He showed her how to prepare the crust, mixing flour and butter and a tiny amount of water until the dough came together in a smooth ball. He taught her to peel and slice the apples, to mix them with sugar and cinnamon, and a squeeze of lemon juice that brought out their sweetness. He demonstrated the art of crimping the edges of the crust, creating the distinctive pattern that marked a proper German apple pie. The smell that filled the kitchen as the pie baked was extraordinary. Sweet and spicy and warm, it drifted out of the mess hall and across the camp, drawing curious glances from guards and prisoners alike. When the pie came out of the oven, golden brown and bubbling with juice, Jim cut a slice and handed it to Elsa. "Taste," he said. "Tell me what you think." Elsa took a bite. The crust shattered against her teeth, releasing the soft, sweet filling within. The apples were perfectly cooked, firm enough to hold their shape, but tender enough to melt on her tongue. The cinnamon and sugar mingled in a flavor that was both familiar and exotic, a taste that seemed to contain entire worlds. She closed her eyes and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "This is what peace tastes like," she whispered. Jim looked at her with an expression that mixed pride and sorrow in equal measure. He thought about his grandmother, about the last time he had tasted her apple pie, about all the years that had passed since then. He thought about the war that had separated them, about the beans that might have killed her, about the uncertainty that still gnawed at his heart every single day. And he thought about this girl, this young German woman who had come to his kitchen as an enemy and was slowly becoming something else entirely. A student, a friend, a reminder that the bonds between people could survive even the worst catastrophes that history could devise. "Keep the recipe," he said gruffly, pressing the card into her hands. "My grandmother would have wanted it to go to someone who would appreciate it." Elsa looked at the card, at the handwriting of a woman she would never meet, and she understood that she had been given something precious. Not just a recipe, but a connection, a thread linking her to a past she had never known and a future she was only beginning to imagine. She did not know then that she would carry that recipe with her for the rest of her life, that she would make apple pie every Christmas for her children and grandchildren, telling them the story of the Texas cook and his Hamburg grandmother, that the simple act of baking would become a ritual of remembrance, a way of honoring the people and the moments that had shaped her. All she knew in that moment was that she was holding something that mattered, and that was enough. But the most important revelation was still to come. It would happen on a warm August evening when the sun was setting over the desert and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And it would come from the most unexpected source. Hilda Braun had been watching and waiting. The oldest of the German women, she had maintained her skepticism long after the others had begun to soften. She ate the American food without gratitude. She performed her assigned work without complaint, but also without enthusiasm. She kept her distance from the guards, from Captain Harrison, from everyone who represented the power that had held her captive. But she had also been observing and thinking and wrestling with something that had been eating at her soul for longer than anyone knew. One evening, as the August heat finally began to release its grip on the land, Hilda approached Greta in the yard outside their barracks. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alone." Greta looked at the older woman, saw something in her eyes that she had never seen before. It was fear, but not the fear of death or punishment. It was a deeper fear, the fear of a truth that could no longer be contained. They walked to the far corner of the yard, where a scraggly mesquite tree provided minimal shade and a modicum of privacy. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, stretching their shadows long across the dusty ground. "Before I was a factory secretary," Hilda began, "I worked in Berlin, in a government office. I typed reports." Greta waited, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "Reports about trains," Hilda continued. "Trains going east, carrying passengers who never came back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Greta did not want to examine. But she forced herself to listen, to witness, to receive whatever confession Hilda needed to make. "They told us it was resettlement," Hilda said, her voice cracking. "They told us the passengers were being relocated to work camps. We believed them. We wanted to believe them." She paused, gathering herself for what came next. "But I started noticing things. The numbers did not add up. Thousands of people were being shipped east every week, but there were no reports of arrivals, no records of where they went, no letters from workers to their families. They just disappeared." Greta felt cold despite the lingering heat of the day. She knew what Hilda was describing. The rumors had circulated even during the war, whispers about camps that were not labor camps, about trains that carried people to destinations from which no one returned. She had dismissed those rumors at the time, unwilling to believe that her own country could be capable of such things. Now, looking into Hilda's anguished eyes, she could no longer dismiss anything. "I asked questions once," Hilda said. "Only once. My supervisor looked at me and said, "Do not ask about things you do not want to know if you value your life." After that, I stopped asking. I kept typing. I kept my head down. I survived. She turned to face Greta directly, and the younger woman saw tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Do you understand what I am telling you? I helped. I was part of it. I typed the schedules that sent those people to their deaths. I knew on some level that something terrible was happening, and I did nothing. I said nothing. I just kept typing." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Why are you telling me this?" Greta finally asked. "Because of them," Hilda said, gesturing toward the camp around them. "Because of the Americans." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that seemed almost childlike in its vulnerability. "They know what we did. They know the crimes our country committed. They have seen the camps, the bodies, and evidence of everything we tried to hide. They have every reason to hate us, to punish us, to treat us the way we treated, the way we—" She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "But instead, they feed us," she continued after a moment. "They give us medical care. They treat us with dignity. They look at us and see human beings, even though we were part of a system that treated millions of people as less than human." She met Greta's eyes with an intensity that was almost painful. "That is real strength. Not the strength to destroy your enemies, but the strength to show them mercy. The strength to be kind when you have every right to be cruel. That is what I have learned here. And that is why I needed to tell someone what I did. Because I cannot carry this secret anymore. Because if the Americans can be kind to me, then maybe somehow I can learn to be kind to myself." Greta reached out and took Hilda's hand. The older woman's fingers were cold and trembling, and she gripped Greta's hand with a desperation that spoke of years of suppressed guilt and shame. They stood there together as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that could undo the pasties or erase the horror of what Hilda had described. But there was something in the simple act of presence of witness of one human being standing beside another in their moment of greatest vulnerability. And Greta understood something that she had been circling around for weeks. The question was not whether she was guilty or innocent. Everyone who had lived through the war carried some measure of guilt, whether through action or inaction, through participation or silence. The question was what to do with that guilt, whether to let it consume you or to transform it into something else, whether to remain a monster or to choose to be human. She thought about Jim Crawford and his grandmother's words, "Kindness has no nationality." She thought about Captain Harrison and his insistence that the war was over, that enemies could become something else. She thought about the breakfast she had eaten that first morning, the bacon and eggs that had tasted like salvation. And she made a decision. Whatever she had been before, whatever she had done or failed to do, she would not let it define her future. She would learn from the Americans, from their unexpected mercy, from their stubborn belief that people could change. She would become someone who gave kindness instead of cruelty, who chose compassion over hatred, who refused to let the darkness of the past extinguish the possibility of light. It would not be easy. It would take time and effort and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it was possible. The proof was all around her in the mess hall and the medical station and the quiet conversations that were slowly building bridges across the chasm of war. She squeezed Hilda's hand one more time, then released it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You were brave to speak." Hilda shook her head. Not brave, just tired. Tired of carrying it alone. They walked back to the barracks together, two women who had entered Fort Davis as enemies, and were leaving this conversation as something closer to allies. Not friends, perhaps. Not yet. But something more than strangers. Something more than the labels that war had tried to force upon them. The night settled over the camp, and somewhere in the kitchen, Jim Crawford was cleaning up after dinner, humming a song he had learned in Hamburg 50 years ago. In the medical station, Lieutenant Chen was finishing his reports, noting that the German prisoners were healthier than they had been when they arrived. In her office, the camp's administrative clerk was updating records, preparing for the day when these women would be sent home to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. The war was over. But the work of healing was just beginning. And in the darkness of the Texas desert, under a sky blazing with more stars than Greta had ever seen in her life, she allowed herself to believe that healing might actually be possible. Not just for herself, but for all of them. For the prisoners and the guards, for the Germans and the Americans, for everyone who had been touched by the madness of a war that should never have happened. It was a fragile hope, easily shattered by the harsh realities that still awaited them. But it was hope nonetheless. And sometimes, in the aftermath of destruction, hope is the only thing that matters. The news arrived on a morning that felt like any other. August had settled over Fort Davis with its usual brutal heat, turning the desert into a shimmering sea of mirages and making every movement feel like wading through invisible molasses. The women had adapted to the rhythm of Texas summers, rising early to complete their work before the worst of the heat descended, then retreating to whatever shade they could find until evening brought relief. Greta was in the medical station helping Lieutenant Chen inventory supplies when Captain Harrison's voice crackled over the camp's public address system. All personnel and prisoners report to the main assembly area immediately. There was something in his voice that made Greta's stomach tighten. Not alarm exactly, but a gravity that suggested something significant was about to happen. She exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Chen, who shrugged and set down his clipboard. "Guess we better go see what this is about," he said. They walked together toward the assembly area, joining a stream of guards and prisoners, all converging on the same point. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Greta could feel sweat already beginning to soak through her simple cotton dress. Around her, she could hear whispered speculation in both English and German, everyone trying to guess what announcement could be important enough to interrupt the morning routine. Captain Harrison stood on a small wooden platform at the center of the assembly area, flanked by his senior officers. His face was difficult to read, a mixture of solemnity and something that might have been relief. Beside him, Corporal Weber waited with the portable microphone that he used for translations. The crowd settled into an expectant silence. "I have just received word from Washington." Harrison began, his voice carrying across the assembly area with surprising clarity. 2 days ago, on August 14th, Japan announced its unconditional surrender to Allied forces. The war is over. For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed to hang in the air, too large and too significant to be absorbed immediately. Then somewhere in the crowd of American soldiers, someone let out a whoop of joy. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the assembly area erupted in cheers and shouts, in the kind of unrestrained celebration that only comes at the end of a long nightmare. Greta stood motionless amid the chaos, trying to process what she had just heard. The war was over. After 6 years of destruction, of death, of watching everything she knew crumble into ash, it was finally finished. No more bombs falling on German cities. No more young men being fed into the meat grinder of battle. No more waking up each morning wondering if this would be the day the world ended. She should have felt joy. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as if the news had carved out a space in her that she did not know how to fill. What now? That was the question that pressed against the inside of her skull. What happened when the war ended and there was no longer a conflict to define who she was and where she belonged? What did you do when the enemy became just another person and the labels that had organized your world suddenly lost their meaning? Around her, the other German women were reacting in various ways. Some were crying, whether from relief or grief, or simple emotional overwhelm. It was impossible to tell. Others stood in stunned silence, their faces blank with the effort of comprehension. A few had begun to talk rapidly among themselves, their words tumbling over each other as they tried to make sense of this new reality. Elsa had grabbed Greta's arm and was squeezing it so tightly that it hurt. "It is over," the young woman kept repeating. "It is really over." Greta nodded, but she could not bring herself to speak. The emptiness inside her was growing, spreading through her chest like a cold fog. She had spent so long preparing for death, for suffering, for the endless continuation of horror, that she had forgotten how to prepare for life. Captain Harrison was speaking again, and Greta forced herself to focus on his words. "For our German prisoners," he was saying, "this means that repatriation proceedings will begin in the coming months. You will be returned to Germany as soon as transportation and logistics can be arranged." Returned to Germany. The words landed like stones in Greta's stomach. What Germany? The country she had left no longer existed. The cities were rubble. The government had collapsed. Millions of people were homeless, starving, wandering through the wreckage of a civilization that had destroyed itself. And her parents. Were they even alive? She had heard nothing from Stuttgart since before her capture. The city had been bombed repeatedly in the final months of the war. For all she knew, her childhood home was now a crater, and her mother and father were buried beneath tons of debris that no one would ever clear. The celebration continued around her, but Greta felt increasingly disconnected from it. She was a ghost at a party, present in body, but absent in spirit, watching the joy of others from across an unbridgeable divide. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Jim Crawford standing behind her, his massive frame blocking out the sun. "Come with me," he said quietly. "I need to show you something." She followed him without question, weaving through the crowd of celebrating soldiers and confused prisoners until they reached the mess hall. The building was empty now, everyone having rushed outside to hear the announcement, and their footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Jim led her to the kitchen, to the small table in the corner where she had first discovered his secret. He sat down heavily and gestured for her to take the seat across from him. "I heard from the Red Cross this morning," he said, before the announcement. They finally found records from Hamburg. Greta felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew what was coming. She could see it in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his massive hands lay flat on the table, as if he no longer had the strength to lift them. "My grandmother died in 19 more," Jim continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the bombing. The house she lived in, the house where I was born, it took a direct hit. They say she would not have suffered. It was instant." He looked up at her, and she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. This giant of a man, this pillar of strength who had fed hundreds of prisoners without ever showing a crack in his armor, was weeping like a child. "I always hoped," he said, "even when I knew it was foolish, I hoped that somehow she had survived. That one day when this was all over, I could go back to Hamburg and find her sitting in her kitchen, making apple pie, waiting for her, Johann, to come home." He shook his head slowly, as if the motion could dispel the reality he was being forced to accept. "But she is gone. She has been gone for more than a year, and I did not even know." Greta reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture felt inadequate, a tiny offering in the face of such enormous loss. But it was all she had. "I am sorry," she said. "I am so sorry." They sat together in silence as the sounds of celebration drifted in from outside. Two people bound by loss and language, by shared heritage, and the strange circumstances of war, holding on to each other in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and memory. After a long while, Jim spoke again. "She would have liked you," he said. "My grandmother, she always said that kindness was the most important thing. That people who were kind to others, even to strangers, even to enemies, those were the people worth knowing." He squeezed her hand once, then released it. "You are that kind of person, Margaret. I have watched you these past months. The way you help in the medical station. The way you take care of the younger women. The way you listen to people, really listen, even when their stories are painful. You have a good heart." Greta did not know how to respond. She did not feel like a good person. She felt like a survivor, someone who had done whatever was necessary to make it through the war, who had closed her eyes to uncomfortable truths and kept her head down when courage would have demanded more. But maybe that was the point. Maybe being good was not about being perfect. Maybe it was about trying day after day to be a little better than you were before. Maybe it was about learning from your mistakes and choosing kindness even when hatred would have been easier. She thought about Hilda's confession about the trains and the silence and the guilt that had eaten at the older woman for years. She thought about her own complicity, her own willingness to accept the lies she had been told, because questioning them would have been dangerous. She thought about all the ways that ordinary people became part of an extraordinary evil, simply by going along, by not asking questions, by pretending not to see what was right in front of their eyes. And she thought about what Jim had said. Kindness is the most important thing. It sounded so simple, almost childishly naive. But maybe simple things were the hardest to practice. Maybe kindness required more courage than cruelty, more strength than violence, more wisdom than hatred. "I want to be that kind of person," she said finally. "I want to learn how." Jim nodded slowly. "Then learn," he said. "Every day make one choice that is kind instead of cruel. Help one person who needs help. Listen to one story that needs to be heard. It is not complicated, it is just difficult. And you have to keep doing it even when it would be easier to stop." He stood up, his joints creaking with the effort, and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. He opened it and removed something wrapped in cloth. "I want you to have this," he said, placing the bundle on the table in front of her. Greta unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the flowing Germanic script she had come to recognize. It was the recipe. His grandmother's apple pie recipe. The one he had shown Elsa, the one that had been in his family for 3 generations. "I cannot accept this," she said. "This is too precious. This is your family's history." Jim shook his head. "My grandmother believed that recipes were meant to be shared," he said. "She believed that food was a way of connecting people, of building bridges between strangers, of turning enemies into friends. If she were here, she would want you to have this. She would want it to go to someone who would understand what it means." He tapped the paper with one thick finger. "Make this pie," he said. "Make it for your children someday, and your grandchildren. Tell them the story of how you got it. Tell them about a cook in Texas who learned kindness from a grandmother in Hamburg. Tell them that the war tried to make us enemies, but we refused to stay that way." Greta looked at the recipe through a blur of tears. The handwriting was elegant, the strokes confident and sure. At the bottom, in slightly different ink, was a name and a date: Margarete Schmidt, Hamburg, 1935. She thought about the woman who had written these words. A grandmother who had loved her grandson enough to send him across an ocean to safety. A woman who had stayed behind in a city that would eventually be destroyed. A keeper of recipes and stories, and the simple wisdom that kindness matters more than nationality. "Thank you," Greta whispered. "I will honor it, I promise." Jim nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. Then he turned back to his kitchen, his domain, the place where he had spent the war years, transforming ingredients into sustenance and isolation into connection. The celebration outside was beginning to die down, replaced by the more mundane concerns of lunch preparation and afternoon routines. The war might be over, but people still needed to eat. Life continued as it always did, regardless of the headlines and the history books and the grand narratives that tried to make sense of human chaos. Greta carefully folded the recipe and tucked it into her pocket next to her heart. Then she walked out of the mess hall and into the blazing Texas sun, carrying with her a gift from a dead woman she had never met and a promise to a living man she would never forget. The weeks that followed were filled with decisions. Captain Harrison gathered the German women and explained their options. Those who wished to return to Germany immediately could register for the first available transport ships. Those who preferred to wait or who had no homes to return to could volunteer for work programs in the American occupation zone, helping with reconstruction and relief efforts. It was a choice that would shape the rest of their lives. Hilda was among the first to register for return. She had received word through the Red Cross that her husband was alive, held in a prisoner of war camp in England. They would both be released soon, and she wanted to be there when he came home. "I have to face what I was part of," she told Greta on her last night at Fort Davis. "I cannot run from it anymore. I have to go back to Germany and help rebuild. It is the only way I can live with myself." She paused, her weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of the barracks lamp. "But I will never forget what I learned here," she continued. "About mercy, about kindness, about the strength it takes to be good to your enemies. I will carry that with me always." She embraced Greta, then a fierce hug that communicated more than words ever could. Then she was gone, climbing into a truck that would take her to the coast, to a ship, to a country that existed now only in memory and imagination. Elsa made a different choice. "I have nothing to go back to," she explained to Greta. "My parents are dead. My home is destroyed. Everyone I knew before the war is either dead or scattered to the winds. What would I even do in Germany?" She looked out the window at the vast Texas landscape, at the endless sky and the distant mountains. "Here I have learned things," she continued. "I have learned to cook, really cook, not just survive. I have learned English. I have learned that Americans are not monsters. And I have learned that I can be useful, that I can contribute, that I have value beyond the labels that were forced on me." She turned back to Greta with a shy smile. "There is a relief program in Munich that needs interpreters and kitchen staff," she said. "Jim wrote me a recommendation. I am going to apply." Greta felt a surge of pride in the young woman. 3 months ago, Elsa had been a terrified girl who believed she would never be kissed. Now she was making plans, setting goals, building a future from the ruins of the past. "You will be wonderful," Greta said. "And you must write to me. I want to know everything that happens to you." Elsa promised she would, and Greta herself. Her decision had been the most difficult of all. Part of her wanted to rush back to Stuttgart to find her parents to reassure herself that they were alive. The uncertainty had been eating at her for months, a constant low-level anxiety that never quite went away. But another part of her understood that she could do more good by staying involved with the American reconstruction efforts. Her nursing skills were needed, her knowledge of German language and culture was valuable. And there was something about the idea of working alongside the former enemy, of building something positive from the wreckage of war, that appealed to her sense of purpose. In the end, she had applied for a position at an American field hospital in Stuttgart. It would allow her to search for her parents while also contributing to the recovery. It felt like a compromise that honored both her personal needs and her larger obligations. "I will find them," she told Jim on her last day at Fort Davis. "I have to believe that they survived. And if they did not," she paused, forcing herself to contemplate the possibility. "If they did not, then I will honor their memory by helping others. That is what they would have wanted." Jim nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You are a good woman, Margaret," he said. "Whatever happens, remember that. You are not defined by the war. You are not defined by the things your country did. You are defined by the choices you make starting now." He handed her a small envelope. "My address in Marfa," he said. "When this is all over, when the world makes sense again, write to me. Tell me how you are doing. Tell me if you found your parents. Tell me if you made the apple pie." Greta took the envelope and held it against her chest. "I will," she promised. "And you must write back. Tell me about Texas. Tell me about the ranch you always talk about. Tell me if the coyotes still howl at night." They stood facing each other in the kitchen that had witnessed so many conversations, so many secrets, shared so many barriers broken down. Neither wanted to say goodbye. Goodbye felt too final, too absolute, too much like an ending when they both wanted to believe in new beginnings. "Not goodbye," Jim said finally. "Just until next time." "Until next time," Greta agreed. She turned and walked out of the mess hall, out of Fort Davis, out of the strange parenthesis that had suspended her between past and future for 3 months. Behind her, Jim Crawford stood in the doorway of his kitchen, watching her go, a massive figure, silhouetted against the harsh Texas light. Neither of them knew if they would ever see each other again. The world was still in chaos, still sorting itself out, still trying to figure out what came after the bloodiest conflict in human history. But they had hope. And sometimes in the aftermath of destruction, hope is the only thing that matters. The day of departure arrived with the harsh clarity of a September morning. Military trucks lined up in front of the camp, their canvas covers flapping in the desert wind. The German women who had chosen to leave gathered in small clusters, clutching bags that contained everything they owned, which in most cases was not much. A few changes of clothes, some toiletries, letters from home for those fortunate enough to have received them. Small gifts from the Americans who had become, against all expectations, something like friends. Greta stood apart from the others, taking one last look at the place that had transformed her understanding of enemies and allies, of hatred and forgiveness, of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed determined to strip humanity away. 3 months ago, she had entered this camp expecting to die. She had knelt on frozen ground, praying for a quick end, convinced that the monsters she had been taught to fear would show no mercy. Instead, she had found bacon and eggs. She had found a giant cook with a gentle heart and a secret German heritage. She had found a commanding officer who believed that people were more important than the uniforms they wore. She had found the strength to confront her own complicity and the courage to imagine a different future. Fort Davis had not been a prison. It had been a school, and the lesson it had taught her was one she would carry for the rest of her life: that the walls between people are built by fear and propaganda, and they can be torn down by nothing more complicated than kindness. Jim emerged from the mess hall, wiping his hands on his apron. He had been up since before dawn, preparing one final breakfast for the departing women, refusing to let them leave on empty stomachs. He approached Greta with the same slow, deliberate gait she had come to know so well. In his hands, he carried a paper bag, the top neatly folded over. "For the journey," he said, pressing the bag into her hands. "Apple pie. Made it special this morning." Greta felt tears prick at her eyes. Of course he had. Of course this man who had shown her what grace under pressure looked like, who had shared his deepest pain and his most precious memories with a woman who should have been his enemy, would send her off with apple pie. "Thank you," she said, For everything. Jim shook his head. Thank you, he replied, for listening, for understanding, for being the kind of person my grandmother would have been proud to know. They embraced then a brief but fierce hug that communicated everything words could not express. Gratitude, respect, affection, the peculiar bond that forms between people who have seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen compassion over judgment. Take care of yourself, Johann Greta whispered, using his birth name for the first and only time. You too, Margaret, he replied. Then it was time to go. The trucks were loaded, the drivers were ready, and the bureaucracy of repatriation would wait for no one. Greta climbed into the back of the vehicle that would take her to the coast, finding a seat between Elsa and several other women she had come to know during her months at Fort Davis. As the truck pulled away, she looked back through the canvas opening. Jim Crawford stood at the edge of the road, one hand raised in farewell, his massive silhouette growing smaller and smaller until it was just a speck against the vast Texas landscape. Greta raised her own hand in response, holding it there until the camp disappeared entirely, and there was nothing left but desert and sky and the long road ahead. 10 years passed. The world rebuilt itself in fits and starts, transforming from the wreckage of war into something new and strange and cautiously hopeful. Cities rose from rubble. Economies recovered. Old enemies became allies, and the divisions that had seemed so absolute began to blur and fade. Greta Hoffmann found her parents alive in a refugee shelter outside Stuttgart. The reunion was everything she had imagined, and more, a collision of joy and grief and the overwhelming relief of knowing that some things at least had survived the destruction. She kept her promise. She worked at the American Field Hospital, helping to heal the physical and psychological wounds of a shattered population. She learned English properly, became an interpreter, eventually rose to become head nurse of the facility. She built a life from the ground up, brick by brick, choice by choice, always guided by the simple principle that kindness mattered more than anything else. And every year on June 7th, the anniversary of the morning she had expected to die, she made apple pie. Grandmother Schmidt's recipe followed exactly, producing the same golden crust and sweet filling that Jim Crawford had taught Elsa to make in that kitchen so many years ago. It became her ritual, her way of remembering. As she peeled the apples and mixed the cinnamon and rolled out the dough, she would tell the story. First to her colleagues, then to the children who began appearing at the hospital seeking care, then eventually to the family she built around herself in the years that followed. This recipe came from Hamburg, she would say. It was created by a woman I never met, a grandmother who taught her grandson that kindness has no nationality. I received it in a prisoner of war camp in Texas from an American cook who was born German, who lost everything in the war but never lost his humanity. The pie became famous in her small corner of Stuttgart. People would come from across the city to taste it, to hear the story, to be reminded that even in the darkest times, human connections could survive and flourish. In the summer of 1955, a letter arrived from Texas. Greta recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same careful script she remembered from the envelope Jim had given her on her last day at Fort Davis. She opened it with trembling fingers, her heart suddenly pounding with an emotion she could not quite name. Dear Margaret, the letter began. I hope this finds you well. I have thought about writing many times over the years, but I never knew what to say. The war feels so long ago now, like something that happened to different people in a different world. And yet I still remember every moment of those months at Fort Davis. I still remember the conversations we had, the secrets we shared, the hope we found in the most unlikely of places. I am writing now because I finally have some news to share. After 10 years of searching, I managed to find records of what happened to my grandmother's house in Hamburg. The neighborhood has been completely rebuilt. The house is gone, of course, but they have put up a small memorial where it used to stand. A plaque with the names of everyone who died in that bombing raid. I cannot go there myself. My health is not what it used to be, and the journey would be too difficult. But knowing that her name is written somewhere that she is remembered, that gives me peace. There was more. News about Fort Davis, which had been closed and converted to other uses. Updates about some of the soldiers who had served there, where they had ended up, what they were doing with their lives. Small details about Jim's own existence, his retirement from the army, his return to Marfa, his quiet days on the ranch he had always dreamed of owning. And then near the end, a paragraph that made Greta's breath catch in her own throat. I also received a letter from young Elsa last month. You remember her, the girl from the ammunition factory? She lives in California. Now married to an American soldier she met during the Reconstruction. They have two children, a boy and a girl, and she tells me she makes apple pie every Christmas. She sent a photograph. I am enclosing it with this letter so you can see for yourself. She looks happy, Margaret. She looks like someone who has found her place in the world. And I like to think that we had something to do with that. Not just me, but all of us. Everyone who showed her kindness when she expected cruelty. Everyone who helped her believe that the future could be better than the past. That is what I wanted to tell you, I suppose. That it mattered. What we did at Fort Davis, the way we treated each other, the bridges we built across all those walls that were supposed to keep us apart. It mattered. It changed lives. It is still changing lives 10 years later in ways we could never have predicted. Kindness has no nationality. My grandmother was right about that, and I am grateful every day that I had the chance to prove it. The letter was signed, simply Jim. Greta read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she looked at the photograph that had been enclosed. Elsa, now a grown woman of 29, stood in front of a small house with a white picket fence. A man in civilian clothes had his arm around her waist, and 2 children sat at their feet grinning at the camera. She looked happy. She looked like someone who had survived the darkness and found her way into the light. Greta carefully folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where she kept her most precious possessions. The recipe was there too, yellowed with age but still legible, still bearing the handwriting of a woman who had died in a Hamburg bombing raid more than a decade ago. 2 documents, 2 pieces of paper, and yet they represented everything that mattered. Connection across distance, kindness across boundaries, hope that survived even the most determined efforts to destroy it. She walked to her window and looked out at the Stuttgart skyline. The city had been rebuilt almost beyond recognition. Modern buildings rising where medieval structures had once stood. But beneath the new construction, beneath the glass and steel and concrete, the bones of the old city remained. History could not be erased. It could only be transformed. And perhaps that was the lesson. Not that the past could be forgotten, but that it could be redeemed. Not that wounds would disappear, but that they could heal. Not that enemies would stop being enemies, but that they could choose to become something else. She thought about Jim Crawford aging now in his Texas ranch, surrounded by the landscape that had shaped him. She thought about Elsa in California making apple pie for her children, telling them stories about a prisoner of war camp where she had learned to hope. She thought about Hilda somewhere in Germany, carrying her guilt and her hard-won wisdom into whatever future she had managed to build. And she thought about herself, a nurse who had become a healer, a prisoner who had become free, a woman who had expected death and received breakfast instead. The story of Fort Davis was not just her story. It was the story of everyone who had passed through that camp, everyone who had been touched by its unlikely lessons, everyone who had carried its message of kindness and mercy into the wider world. And as long as people kept telling, it kept making apple pies and sharing recipes and remembering that enemies could become friends, the story would never really end. Greta Hoffman lived until 2006, passing away peacefully at the age of 89. She was buried in Stuttgart, in the city where she had been born and where she had spent her final decades helping others heal from the wounds of war and time. On her desk when she died, they found a single sheet of paper. It was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still readable. A recipe for apple pie written in flowing Germanic script with a name at the bottom. Margaret Schmidt, Hamburg, 1935. Beside it was a photograph, also faded, showing a group of women standing in front of a wooden barracks building. The sky behind them was bright with Texas sun, and despite everything they had been through, despite all the fear and uncertainty and loss, some of them were smiling. This is what remains when the history books are closed and the monuments are built and the world moves on to new conflicts and new crises. Not the grand narratives of nations and armies, but the small moments of human connection. A recipe passed from hand to hand, a photograph preserved through decades, a story told and retold until it becomes part of something larger than any individual life. Greta's family kept the recipe. They made the pie every year on June 7th, just as she had done, and they told the story to anyone who would listen, about a prisoner of war camp in Texas, about a cook named Jim who had been born Johann, about a grandmother in Hamburg who believed that kindness has no nationality. Jim Crawford died in 1978 on his ranch outside Marfa. He was buried with military honors, his service to his country recognized and celebrated. But the epitaph he had requested for his headstone said nothing about battles or medals or military rank. It said simply, he fed the hungry. That was how he wanted to be remembered. Not as a soldier, but as a cook. Not as a warrior, but as a nurturer. Not as someone who defeated enemies, but as someone who turned enemies into friends. And Elsa Roberts, as she was known, after her marriage lived to see the new millennium. She raised 4 children in California, all of them proud Americans, all of them knowing the story of their mother's journey from a German ammunition factory to a Texas prison camp to the sunny shores of San Diego. Every Christmas until the year she died, she made apple pie. Grandmother Schmidt's recipe modified slightly over the decades to account for American ingredients and California taste, but still recognizably the same. Golden crust, sweet filling. The taste of memory and hope and second chances. Her grandchildren, who never knew the war, who grew up in a world where Germany and America were allies, and the battles of the 1940s seemed as distant as ancient history, would gather around her kitchen table and listen to her stories. Tell us again, they would say. Tell us about the breakfast. And Elsa would smile, her eyes bright with the memories of a lifetime, and begin the story once more. This is what happened, she would say, when the enemy brought breakfast. This is what happened when people chose kindness over cruelty, mercy over vengeance, hope over despair. This is what happened when a cook in Texas showed a group of frightened German women that the world could be different from what they had been taught to expect. This is what happened when ordinary people in an extraordinary time decided that the walls between them were not as strong as the bonds they could build. And this is what we must remember always, no matter how much time passes or how much the world changes. That hatred is a choice. That kindness is a choice. That every day in small ways and large, we decide what kind of people we want to be. The women of Fort Davis chose kindness. The Americans who guarded them chose mercy. And together in a small camp in the middle of the Texas desert, they proved that even the deepest divisions can be healed. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is the legacy that we carry forward, one apple pie at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one choice at a time. And as long as we keep telling it, as long as we keep remembering, the story will never truly end. Because dawn always comes after the darkest night, and sometimes the light arrives in the most unexpected forms. A plate of bacon and eggs, a cup of strong Texas coffee, a recipe written in a grandmother's hand, and the simple, profound, world-changing decision to treat an enemy like a human being. This is what we remember. This is what we pass on. This is what matters more than all the battles and treaties and grand historical narratives. Kindness has no nationality, and breakfast shared with compassion can change the world.